is that we have core identities, which are expressions of our essential self. That's where we're congruent. That's where we are energized toward, not away from. That's where we actually create a value for ourselves and for the world around us. We also have these counterfeit identities, which are the result of the self limiting beliefs and these negative patterns, including trauma, overwhelm. And so, one way to think about it is as we increase the number of core identity expressions that we have and decrease the number of counterfeit identities, we increase our energy. It's just a metric, not just. It is a metric as one way of looking at what we're talking about today, which is that movement from traumatic overwhelm to energetic freedom. Um, we're really happy to be here for the 10X Mindset podcast. Today, we're going to talk about moving from traumatic overwhelm to energetic freedom. This is something that is very personal to us, but it's also something very universal in people's experience. Trauma can be thought of in different ways. I mean, you can have acute trauma, like a car accident or something like that, or you can have chronic trauma where, for example, domestic abuse, or you can have complex trauma where you have multiple kinds of trauma, all kind of interfacing on and impacting us as individuals. One of the ways that we think about this is that everyone has trauma. If you've had a great childhood, you still will have had experiences that create patterns in your own life and where we make decisions, draw conclusions, and limit ourselves. So it could be fairly mild, but most people have experiences that are beyond that. Something that you have with a teacher or a coach or a peer that really is difficult for you, is distressing. It even then moves to something that could be overwhelming. For me, where one of the reasons I'm passionately interested in this is that when I was 12, my dad died. And I would say that is an acute trauma. Subsequently, I recognized there've been at least 5 acute traumas in my life like that. I had a major car accident, and I had a bunch of other things happen. I even had I even had a divorce, which was my first marriage, and that was traumatic because I realized I created it because of my lack of healing in my own life, but I also experienced it. And it was like unexpected and, oh gosh, painful, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's like, what do you do? Do you ignore it, stuff it down, or do you actually engage it? And so, what we in the 10X mindset point of view come from is we want to identify what those patterns are that are traumatic based. And we want to use the skills and capacities of NLP and whatever else we have, meditation, mindfulness, emotional freedom technique, etc. Whatever resources we have that are strategic change operations to be able to actually transform those patterns. And so one of the ways, given an NLP mindset that we use, is what we call the 10X Tote. And so that is basically a model which has a present state in relationship to a desired state. And there's a choice point which says, yeah, have I moved from where I am to where I want to be? And if I haven't, then what I do, I operate. That's the O part of the tote. We keep operating until we move the present state to the desired state. We get a match, we get the match, and then we exit. The point of the exit in today's episode is that when we address the traumatic pattern, we actually release energy that's invested in maintaining that pattern. And often that's unconscious. So part of the whole effort required is to become increasingly aware of what these patterns are, what the anchoring beliefs are in the patterns, which will be part of your present state, and what kind of resources we have to bring to bear on that. Another way of thinking about that is, if I think about this, is that you can have fairly surface level trauma. So, where you go, I'm in distress over the fact that I'm not doing my taxes on time, and that can pile up with a bunch of other things, a bunch of expectations. You got jobs you got family demands, you got your in-laws, you got your parents, you got a lot of demands on you, a lot of expectations on you. And when those expectations have unresolved conclusions, they require energy. And so, one of the things we're going to focus on and direct ourselves toward today is whether that's that surface level trauma, whether it's more like along the lines of burnout or more of identity based trauma. When you address the pattern and able to resolve it, bring closure to it, you release energy. And so, one of our concepts is that open totes that they carry expectation of closure and they're not being closed, they require energy. And so to close them actually brings relief. It brings release of energy. It enables us to go into creativity and be expressive in that way. The other distinction that we make is that there's some open totes that are actually very energizing. They draw you toward them. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about where there's that expectation that you need to get this finished and somehow, but you're not doing that. And that is where we feel like we can actually begin to address that we can deal with it. So I would just say at a kind of the deep level, identity based trauma for me was that event was my dad's death and took me many years, lots of resources to actually get out of that painful situation and become generative with regard to the ways in which I've been able to respond have actually given me energy, which is true, and I think people who experience adversity and come through it become much stronger, and partly that's because the energy released from the pain, from the suffering, from the deep trauma is incredibly invigorating. So that's one level. There's another level, like I grew up in a family system that was shame-based. Shame-based systems actually lead to performance orientation, which is never resolved. I mean, you're never good enough, right? So, okay, I've been successful in school. Now I need to be successful in sports. Now I need to be successful in life. It's just like it never ends. And for me, that experience of a family system of shame, I was aware of it, but I didn't know how to deal with it. And in 2015, my wife and I went to a place called Brain State at the time. It's changed the name now, but it's brainwave optimization, literally influencing the neurons and the neurological patterns. I did not know that it was what effect it was going to have, but one of the effects was it released that shame-based pattern that I grew up in my family. So I say, okay, I could, even today, I have great energy just thinking about. I'm free of those thoughts. I'm free of those behaviors. I'm free of that kind of. How do I get out of this? So we want to talk about that, and we want to encourage you to think about yourself in terms of a 10x tote model and to limit the number of these open totes because when you do, you actually remove overwhelm. And in removing the overwhelm, you release creativity, you release capacity, you release vision for your future. So that's kind of the frame we wanted to set for today.
Yeah. I think, I mean, one part of this for me personally came over a lot of the work that I did over the last month and a half. And one of the experiences that I had was that I felt exhausted and I didn't recognize where that exhaustion was coming from, which eventually I recognized over the last month where I used that as an outcome for all the programs and stuff that I was part of. So I would almost call this as an unconscious weight that I was carrying or unconscious patterns that I was carrying. And like you said, Gene, that part of that was for me having all of these things that I didn't bring closure to. I had patterns that I wanted to work on with respect to my relationship with my dad. I had patterns that I wanted to work on with respect to some of the experiences. I recognized that some places I was being very indecisive. And so in our context, we would put this as when you have this unresolved patterns where there are no closure. From an NLP context, we'd call this as an open tote. That you've created a tote where for me, the present state was that, okay, I'm at a place with relationship with my dad, which I would like to change because it wasn't going as well as I would like it to be. And the desired state is obviously I wanted to do something about it and change that or at least bring closure to myself. But since I didn't do that, the tote was open. And as a result of that, this open tote took a lot of energy from me. It's like the amazing way that Gene put it earlier, that to keep all of this totes open needs energy. It takes a lot. It took a lot from me, and when I kind of reached my desired state, when I started bringing closure to a lot of these things, really spend time working on myself, it was almost like the weight was lifted,
Exactly.
and so then I got so much energy out of it. And then I recognized that my exhaustion wasn't a result of my work or me physically being busy. My exhaustion was actually coming from much deeper of holding all of these patterns, keeping all of these patterns open, not making decisions, not making hard decisions, not bringing closure to some of these things, even to the level that there were some changes that I wanted to bring out for my health that I just kept it open. And so part of the exploration, or part of our invitation today is, I mean, of course, like the title suggests, that a lot of these patterns come from past, come from events, could be traumatic events. And again, one of the distinction that I do want to bring is that trauma doesn't mean it's bad or wrong, because there's positive intention and you learn and you experience. But we all go through experiences which have been unresourceful. If anyone comes and tells me that I've had a perfect life, then that itself is traumatic, in my opinion, because that's not possible. That means that you're living in some sort of distortion. So having some of these patterns open, in other words, having some of these totes open and keeping them open takes a lot of energy. And part of our invitation today is to start recognizing these totes in your life. Start recognizing that where do you have these things that creates this weight, that creates burnout, that creates exhaustion, that creates, maybe feeling of not good enough, maybe, just wanting to not do anything. Sometimes, like for me, I know that I've gone into despair as a result of that as well. Like, not engaging with life, but just carrying this weight. And what are some of these totes that you have opened in your life, which you haven't closed? And as a result of that, it's like it needs fuel.
Mm.
And as it is, the fuel prices are increasing. So you don't want to spend your fuel on these totes. And so we want to then move to resolve this tote so that you can free up your energy. Now, of course, in your mind, the question would be, how do we do this? And so what are your thoughts, Gene?
Yeah, well, before I go there, I just want to kind of share one other thing out of my thing, which is the one of the kind of mid-level traumas of my life was that I developed a belief, because beliefs anchor patterns, particularly patterns in counterfeit identities, which we talked about before. But one of those beliefs was I don't have a right to exist. Which is, when you think about that, it's an existential thing, but it was so underground, it was so unconscious. I did not know that I carried that belief. But when you're talking about exhaustion, I go, that's an indicator of, okay, there's some kind of traumatic experience when you're experiencing that continual exhaustion, and it's not physical, and it's really not even emotional. It's much more existential. And so one of the things that I did for that was I chunked down and I said, okay, this is too big. This is too big a context, if you will, to deal with all at once. I will deal with it. I mean, because once I got a hold of, okay, it's there. I knew I wanted to deal with it, and I knew I could eventually, but I needed to chunk it down into more digestible kinds of contexts. And I think that's another way to actually respond to burnout, for example, is when you chunk down and you get closure on the chunks, not just on the big picture of, say, for example, exhaustion. You say, well, what specifically is generating the exhaustion? And for you, one of that was multiple patterns. So you identify, okay, here. So for example, I have 5 patterns related to my dad and my relationship to my dad, his relationship to his health, and all that. And if I just take one of those, I can release energy. When I release energy from that one, I can then apply it to the second one, and then a third one, fourth one, and then eventually you could do all 5, and then the exhaustion just naturally kind of releases. And so that is a demonstration of how we can make the move from kind of traumatic overwhelm or overwhelm to energetic freedom, because what we're realizing is our energetic presence is really what empowers us in the world, for our own lives, for our friends and family, for the impact we want to have in the world, for creativity, all of that resourcefulness, the natural resourcefulness which we have that comes out of our essential self is released when we acknowledge, first of all, that we have trauma. Second of all, we identify what that trauma is, and third of all, we say, okay, if I don't have the resources or tools and techniques, I will get somebody to help me to do them, whether that's therapy or coaching or friendships or whatever. But I will find the resources and I will release those in order that I can have that kind of natural energy coming out of my essential self and all that goes with it. So that's one of the ways to think about and how we have thought about it ourselves to actually release that. If I go back to the I don't have a right to exist as the overarching thing. By chunking down, the very process I just shared with you is what happened was I got more and more energy. I got more and more awareness. And when I began experiencing that's coming out of that belief, that was a real breakthrough for me because okay, that means now I know where to go. Because oftentimes, you're exhausted and you don't know where to go. You don't know what the source of that is. You got to identify the source in order to set your present state. Once you set your present state, embedded in that present state is your desired state. So in this case, embedded in traumatic overwhelm is energetic freedom because that's the flip. That's what happens when you resolve it is you have energy available to you that you didn't have previously. And so in a way, it's like you were saying, Nisha, you do an energy audit. Maybe you could just say a bit about that as a way to orient us to, okay, how do we identify what our present state is and how do we identify what it's going to look like when we resolve it?
Yeah. So, Nagdev, so a good step one of the process would be to recognize, or what I call it as an energy audit, that recognize places in your life where there are things in your life that might give you energy, and then there are things in your life that will take away energy from you. And that's a good first step to start recognizing this for yourself. So, for example, I recognize that, you know, it took a lot of energy for me to spend one-on-one time in a coaching context with people. And I recognize that it's something I really enjoyed doing. Like for most part of my life, I really enjoyed doing that. But last 2 years, it felt like, okay, it's draining my energy. And I recognized that I was doing too much of it. Like, so I reduced it to be at a place where I feel like it's taking away a lot of my energy. So I know I have a tendency to also, be in this indecisive space, and it takes a lot of energy from me. So these are the things that takes away energy. And then there are things that gives you energy. Like I know that playing guitar gives me energy, running sessions, doing this podcast, being with you guys gives me energy. Reading your feedback gives me energy. So making a list of things that what drains your energy, it could be doing particular activities, or it could be being in a certain set of thoughts and beliefs. It could be being with certain set of people, and then recognizing what gives you energy. And that could then start becoming a good indicator that, what's the underlying pattern? What's when something takes away energy, then for me, it's exhaustion, but you might experience different things. Like I said, there could be despair, there could be guilt, there could be shame, there could be so many different things. And then that's a good indicator that, okay, there's something there. And I know that one of my underlying pattern, like because Gene and I have explored, so for like Gene mentioned that I don't have a right to exist. I know that I have that, like I'm not safe. And a lot of my exhaustion comes from keeping everything safe and secure and in control. And I recognize that when I release this pattern, which to be honest, it's still there, but I have released it from many places, it suddenly gave me so much freedom.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and one of the things just want to kind of elaborate on a bit is when we identify, for example, this takes energy. So for example, too much one-on-ones was taking energy from you as where even though you love one-on-ones, you had to get the right proportion. But the question that we need to ask in there, and I love this question, a very basic NLP question. What has to be true for me to be feeling this exhaustion? And The other side of that is what has to be true for me to be energized, excited, and drawn toward whatever the activity is. So in this case, the one-on-one coaching or the podcast or whatever. So what has to be true? And that's the deep level structure that we talk about in NLP. Is like the study of the structure of subjective experience is how we define NLP. Well, if you're going to define it that way, then you need to learn how do you find out what that structure is? And then once you find out what the structure is, in order to change the effect of that pattern in your life, you change the parts of the structure and their relationship with each other. And so that's, it's another way to talk about patterns is that patterns are structure through time, right? And so what we're looking at is making tweaks or even major changes to what the components of the pattern are, and particularly the self-limiting belief. So, and the other thing I want to say is I love presuppositions. Presuppositions in NLP are are subjective truths. And it's like, what has to be true in order for this to be the case? Is it because it goes unconscious? People don't even think about it. So when you're feeling energy, you may not think about what has to be true that you're feeling that energy. But if you ask the question and you start going exploring into it, you will discover resources that will enable you to have energy in other contexts. And similarly, if you explore what has to be the case that I'm feeling overwhelmed, right? And
Yeah.
you go, yeah, one of the answers to that is I have too many open totes that demand attention and that I've not got closure on. That is the answer to the presuppositional question of what has to be true. So that's a way to think about this.
Yeah, great. So now we've got two steps in place. So the first step is to recognize, do an energy audit, recognize where you experience maybe exhaustion, guilt, shame, despair. What are the areas in your life where energy gets drained? And then what are the areas in your life where you get energy out of those activities? Maybe just being in nature. Like I get a lot of energy just by going on a hike, by being in a forest. So what are some of the things that gives you energy? And that starts to give you a cue into what's really going on. And then looking at areas that are draining energy, underlying presupposition we are working with is that you, the energy is getting drained from this area is because there is an underlying pattern, there's an
Yeah.
underlying trauma.
Yeah.
And otherwise, we have unlimited source of energy.
That's right.
So this holding this pattern or holding this trauma is what's taking away energy from all of these areas. And then as a step two is to ask the question that, what has to be true for you to drain energy, for you to feel exhausted or burnout, or for you to feel the way you feel in this? And then the flip side of it. So if we take the example of my one-on-one time, what has to be true for me to feel exhausted with this? But the flip side of it is because I do enjoy it and I do want to experience it. What has to be true for me to feel energized for this one on one again? What has to be true for me to spend time with people that I do want to spend time with, and then unpack that and experience that?
Absolutely. And I think this is really a great way of thinking about this to say, what has to be true in my life to feel, the greatest energy, the greatest kind of enthusiasm, the greatest motivation to live, to live life, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things you and I talked about is that this is a life journey. This is doesn't stop. I mean, once you kind of cross that threshold of okay, I'm no more in remedial change because I got so many things oppressing me, which I think we all more or less we all have that opportunity. But once you cross that threshold, it suddenly becomes very attractive to go, oh, okay, this gives me energy, so I want to go toward it. And the value of the energy audit is say, I want to increase the number of things in my life that give me energy. And it's not just release what's constrained, it's also what adds to my energetic presence. And that's one of the benefits of this kind of work that we're doing is we kind of make that inventory of, okay, let's identify what's worth going toward because of the energetic presence it produces. And one of this, I would just add, this is number three. in the sequence is when we start making that inventory, we realize there's so much possibility for us that we can choose that over this. And that is energetic presence over the weight of the traumatic overwhelm or the overwhelm. And that then what happens when we do that is then when we get triggered with the overwhelm feeling of the weight and all that, we realize, no, no, I don't have to accept this. I can use my, mindset to actually
Mm.
orient to what gives me energy because I now have references. I've gone through and I review them and I go back and review them and I say, I want more of those. I want more. I mean, they're too good, right? So then that's what makes life so full and rich. And that we believe that is really a great demonstration of the potential of all the NLP that we learn, all the NLP that we use, all the NLP that others use with us, just the incredible opportunity that it offers us to live a flourishing life.
Yeah. So, so there are two things here. One is to describe this is that you can have open totes in your life that gives you energy, and you can have open totes in your life that takes away energy. And it's useful to start not have too many totes open in your life that takes away energy, because that can become weight, that can become burnout, exhaustion, or much more at the level of life. But what you said about like that, what makes us feel alive in life, and that to me also is something that we spoke about, that we also have levels of totes. Like we can think about it that, okay, playing guitar gives me energy, and that's one level. That's more level at the behavior. What can I do to give me that gives me energy? But then there is the other level of how can I be that gives me energy? What are some of the beliefs that I've been carrying that's taking away energy? And what are some of the beliefs that I can have that gives me energy, or values like freedom and growth and learning? And how can you step more and more into those values that gives you energy? And then you can think about it at the level of life, right? That what has to be true for you to have energy, have an energetic life that gives you the feeling of being alive and being on top of things.
Yeah, I elaborate a bit on what you're saying, which I think is great. I love the distinction between what do you do that gives you energy, which is the behavioral level, and we all know about that because we've all done that. But who are you? What are you? How do you be that gives you energy? And I think that level is a bit more challenging for people because the being operates at a much more of an embodied level. So whole body feeling, whole body motivation, that kind of thing. And it takes some, at least in my experience, it has taken work to actually begin to specify what those things are. What does it mean to be in such a way that it gives energy? One of the things I would say about that is that having an underlying presupposition about life or a belief about life that life is meant for us to grow and become who we're meant to be, capable of being, who we know in our essential self we actually are, but we have all the constraints we made. And what we're talking about today is we're talking about one way of removing constraints that keep us from the full expression of who we are. And so a way to think about this in the 10x model frame is that we have core identities, which are expressions of our essential self. That's where we're congruent. That's where we are energized toward, not away from. That's where we actually create a value for ourselves and for the world around us. We also have these counterfeit identities, which are the result of the self-limiting beliefs and these negative patterns, including trauma, overwhelm. And so, one way to think about it is as we increase the number of core identity expressions that we have, and decrease the number of counterfeit identities, we increase our energy. It's just a metric, not just. It is a metric as one way of looking at what we're talking about today, which is that movement from traumatic overwhelm to energetic freedom.
Yeah,
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 absolutely.
absolutely.
So if you were to summarize this, if so, we spoke about three steps as an exploration. They're not really a step, but three kind of layers of exploration would be. The first layer is to do energy audit, which is to say, what are some of the totes that gives you energy in your life, and what are some of the totes that takes away energy from your life. And in simple terms, that would be, okay, what gives you energy? What are some of the patterns, behaviors, habits, insight, thoughts that you step into, your identity that you step into more and more that gives you energy? And then what are some of the things that takes away energy, like, being with some people maybe, or some thoughts that you kind of get spiraled into, or an identity statement that you step into. And as you recognize that, recognizing that the space that takes away energy has an underlying presupposition that comes from deeper patterns, that comes from deeper trauma, or traumatic overwhelm, or traumatic patterns. And so it's important to recognize these patterns, and there are two questions to explore these patterns. And when something takes away energy, it's like, okay, what has to be true for it to take that energy away? What has to be true? Like for me, what has to be true for me to feel exhaustion? Or if I'm making an identity statement, like my deeper pattern of I'm not safe, what has to be true for me to not experience safety? And then the flip side of the question, that what has to be true for me to experience safety, or what has to be true for me to experience energy with all these different things that I want to do and I want to experience in life. And then as a next step, as you create more and more awareness, you can think about this at three different levels, because you can think about this at the level of behaviors, that what are you doing? But then you can also think about it in terms of what has to be true in terms of the level of identity, that who are you being? And then maybe at the level of life, that what has to be true for you to be energetic in life, be alive and fully engage in life.
Yeah,
Anything I
absolutely.
missed?
No, I just would say as a chunk down to your last point on number 3 is the inventory of energy givers. So in other words, reviewing in your life the things that give you energy as a series of references to motivate you to actually engage the operations of the tote to move from, low energy to high energy, from overwhelm to energetic freedom. But other than that, yeah, I think it's great.
Great, brilliant. A couple of things then. As you do this process, like I said, that one of the things that gives me, and I'm sure I speak for Gene as well, gives us energy, is reading your thoughts and experiences and feedback and reflection on what happens as you go through some of these activities and processes and exercises. So share that, share your experiences with us so that we can also calibrate what's going on with you. And I mean, part of this is, I'm very, very hopeful that as you do more and more of awareness, of recognizing your open totes that creates exhaustion, and start to close them, start to create exits for all of them, start to bring closure to some of them, maybe you would start to release more and more energy for yourself. And as you do more and more, I mean, that eventually goes to the level of life where you get excited about life, and you get excited about, and that to me is also a great foundation for 10x, right? Because that's when you kind of go like, okay, what can I build and
That's
create in
right.
this world that's 10x? How
That's
can I
right.
be 10x? What is the new thing I can bring in life that's 10x, or for your own self? So I think that's a great platform to be at.
I agree. It's fantastic.
Great, brilliant. So do this process and share this with us, and share your thoughts and reflections with us. And then we'll see you again very soon for the next episode.
That's great.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks.